every new technology in the history of pop led to new modes of production, also to new sounds, whether intended or not. But how does streaming sound, actually? Is it even a technology, or rather a mere new mode of distribution that leads to ever more hegemonic players in the industry, more powerful than any major label we had fussed about for so many decades before streaming arrived? And what type of artist does it favor? The diverse indie type, or where does the old star system creep back into the picture, especially when talking about podcasts, something Spotify concentrates now or has been concentrating on in the last about a year and a half? This is just about the route I think our conversation is going to take. Very, very pleased to do that with one of the great journalistic experts in the field of streaming and platform capitalism, with Liz Pelly in New York City. Liz is a freelance writer and a critic. A lot of her work has appeared in The Baffler, where she is a contributing editor and a columnist. She also teaches at Tisch School for the Arts at New York University. But Liz has a lot of expertise in the field too, so to speak, as a booker, as a musician, as a singer and a drummer, I believe. Now she's here with us from New York to Berlin, from Berlin to New York. Yes, nice to meet you, Liz Pelly.
Nice to meet you too.
As a quick first question before we delve into our conversation, Liz, the questions of agency that usually comes last in those conversations. What is your alternative to Spotify? And because you posted on your website, you posted lists on Buy Music Club. Can you tell us and our audience a little bit about this service? What is Buy Music Club and why would you prefer it over Spotify?
Oh, sure. Well, I think that there are a lot of different ways in which we can envision the way that music is valued and the way resources are created for artists in a big picture way. But in a sort of shorter term, one service that has popped up that clearly is more favorable to musicians over the past few years has been Bandcamp. It's just a economic arrangement that makes a lot more sense for artists whom are not being served by the music streaming status quo, because the majority of the fee that the user pays goes directly to the artist. So the Buy Music Club project that you saw linked on my website is something that I found interesting the past few months because it allows users to create lists of music recommendations, and then each one links off to that artist's Bandcamp page. So you can create a list of listening recommendations that directly links to a platform where artists' work can be purchased directly. But personally, in terms of my preferred mode of listening to music, it would definitely be cassette tapes.
But with Bandcamp, what a lot of people, I think, or I noticed, do not understand is you actually have to buy the music. If you just stream it on Bandcamp, you don't do anything for the artist, right? You have to pay a certain fee, a minimum fee, or you can, of course, pay more if you would like for an album or for certain songs, but you have to actually pay for it. Streaming alone doesn't do any good for the artist, right?
Right. Yeah. That platform is built around buying music from artists, which, in the current reality, I think that the most direct way of supporting musicians is buying music directly from them. Of course, this arrangement doesn't speak to some of the bigger overarching issues with that, which is that we still live in a society where, musicians and artists' viability in some ways lies in their ability to sell music. And I think that, bigger structural reimaginings of how we value art and culture in society would also involve creating resources for artists who maybe, their music is not work that is selling a lot. So, public funding for the arts, things like that.
Yeah. There's been a lot of attention to how Spotify actually alters the music itself, by favoring mid-tempo sad girls with a bit of a breathy retro vibe. To speak very broadly now,
Mhm.
this genre has been called Spotify core or stream bait pop, and you wrote about that phenomenon also. Let us talk a little bit about that. Basically, it's just background music that is not supposed to interfere with whatever you are doing. Now, from a bird's eye view, so to speak, this would just correspond with something FM radio has done for decades, actually, right? What is
Mhm.
specific about stream bait pop on streaming services? What is so different from FM formatted radio that has done or tried to do similar things?
Mhm. Yeah, well, it's pretty interesting, just to kind of like zoom out a little bit. I think it's important to remember that ultimately the critique of these streaming services is rooted in the reality that they're the centers of power in the music industry today. They're like the new centers in which all of the powerful interests in the music industry coalesce. And in order to maintain that center of power, the streaming services have been built around this idea of mass scale and mass growth, because what they're interested in doing is growing their user bases as much as possible. And because of that, they've really been built around, on one hand, favoring the interests of celebrities, and on the other hand, also they've been built around, prioritizing modes of listening that will expand their user base. So they're really interested in just getting as many listeners as possible onto the platform and having those listeners stream as much as possible. So similarly to how other social media platforms and other actors within the platform economy are super focused on engagement metrics, streaming services also think about this. They're thinking about how to get users onto the platform and keep them engaged. So one way that they have done this has been through playlists, and particularly playlists built around moods and moments and activities. And sort of the same way that clickbait functions, what we've seen is a type of mood and moment playlists that sort of preys on user vulnerabilities and emotions. And as you mentioned, I've written a bit over the years about how one side effect of this has been the rise of chill playlists and focus playlists, because these are two, feelings that are particularly popular on these platforms. And one of the sort of side effects of the rise of chill and focus music has been a type of pop music that is suited really well towards these types of playlists, which some would call Spotify core. And yeah, I think when you think about like what does it mean for music in general, that these phenomenons of stream bait and Spotify core, which I should add, within stream bait, there are a lot of different other types of stream bait beyond, Spotify core chill pop musicians.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what it sort of demonstrates is that for a long time, there has been this sort of like mythology that streaming services and also the within the platform economy in general, that these are like neutral tools that anyone could use to build their careers or whatever. And I think when you think about the fact that over time we've seen certain styles of music being prioritized, even for individual musicians within their catalogs, you'll also hear artists talk about how they're within their own catalogs, the song that has the most streams is the song that sounds the most like other songs, or the most, sort of flat song that is adaptable to like multiple different types of playlist environments. So clearly there's certain types of sounds that are being prioritized, and it's sounds that work well in the background. It's sounds that like can adapt to various different playlists. And I think that that's something that needs to sort of be taken into consideration as part of the overall project of like debunking the idea that these platforms could ever be neutral, which also just generally doesn't really make sense when you consider that most corporate streaming services are publicly traded corporations.
Quick question, maybe it deserves a quick answer. Why are there so many female voices in Spotify core, at least as I get? You wrote about Charlotte Lawrence, Nina Nesbitt, Sasha Sloan, while the most streamed artists are still always men. So how do you explain that kind of a difference? That actually what works well for Spotify core are quite, I would say, traditional ideas of what a feminine voice should sound like. On the other hand, the most streamed artists have been for a long time men.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. Like, what are the connections between the way that sexism has played out across these platforms, and where does that intersect with the reality that a lot of Spotify core artists are female women artists. Yeah, I think maybe, ultimately that might have something to do with the way that like women artists are like packaged and sold by the music industry in general. But that is something that I think is deserving of some more critique.
Now, there are two artists whose success sort of transcends Spotify, but whose music does similar things as Spotify. I'm talking about Lana Del Rey and Billie Eilish. The gender model is disputed there. With Eilish, it is usually understood, I think, as empowerment of a female teenager who finally doesn't fulfill any sexist cliches, probably for the first time in history of pop music at all. And then there's Lana Del Rey. There's a lot of talk going on about whether we should buy the feminist take of her or whether it's actually quite retrograde in that respect. So they're very different in that respect, but still they're sort of predecessors of what later was called Spotify core. Is Spotify core to any sort of ideology, or does it favor certain types or tropes? Because as I said, Lana Del Rey and Billie Eilish are actually quite dissimilar artists, so to speak, in that respect.
That's really interesting. It's not, yeah, I haven't, when I wrote this article several years ago about Spotify core, and at the time it was clear that a lot of those artists were in some ways influenced by Lana Del Rey, but I hadn't really given a lot of thought to it. And with Billie Eilish, yeah, that's interesting. The article I always point people to who are interested in more context on Billie Eilish is the one that Penny Fractions published a couple of years ago about the sort of like rise of Billie Eilish. I think they described it as like the music industry sort of coalescing about Billie Eilish was like this like desperate plea for the crumbling music industry to sort of like prove that its new model was working, even though it clearly wasn't. But yeah, those are interesting questions.
What does this do to the careers of so-called stream-based artists, or to Spotify artists in general, actually, in terms of sustainability? Once you were removed from those very popular lists with millions of followers, you were gone for good, so to speak. And we see a lot less sustainability in any artist's careers, actually, in the last 10 years than before the whole music industry collapsed. Definitely before the introduction of MP3 and file sharing the services. Most of the really mainstream artists are like over 50 because they've grown into their success before this collapse actually happened. So would you say this is a direct effect of how streaming works, that your careers are much shorter, and once you're removed from those central lists, it gets a lot harder to actually continue with what you're doing? Or is that a whole different mechanism taking place there?
I think that one thing that is really important to keep in mind about sort of like why this model in general is so different and harmful is that it's this attempt to kind of take this like exploitative one-size-fits-all model that maybe in the past would have been something reserved for the pop music machine, and presenting it as something that should work for artists of all scales. And, you know, I wrote in the piece that I wrote for the book about the new vocabulary or the new alphabet, that although a lot of these streaming services like claim to be democratizing access, like I think what they've actually democratized is exploitation in some ways. It's like now any artist can engage in the exploitative corners of the pop music business that previously only artists signed to major labels had access to.
Yeah. Before we talk about podcasts a little bit, to end this conversation, just one more question to the music itself, actually, because you wrote about that too, that a lot of people observed how the music changed. You know, that the chorus comes like right at the beginning in certain tunes right now, that you have to make everything clear, so to speak, in the first 30 seconds and all that. This is also something that happened in the 60s with a lot of bands that dominated the world. The Beatles did that a lot. A Hard Day's Night, Love Me Do, and so forth. The Stones did it with their anthemic guitar riffs. They always, I mean, in the first half of the 60s at least, started their songs with their choruses, so to speak. Do you think that is sort of ties in with the 60s? I mean, this was before albums became great, right? Whereas the pure single culture, and that the disruptive bands at the moment actually did that for the first time. And now it's Spotify artists trying to do that. Is this, can this be broken down to the culture of the single track as opposed to the album, or is there something different at play here?
Well, I think that all is really important context for understanding the issues of the streaming era, and it raises, you know, the important point that we shouldn't necessarily see all of these issues that artists are up against in the streaming era as necessarily like the result of like a specific technological shift. You know, a lot of these issues have way more to do with the way in which technology has created further efficiencies for dynamics that already existed within the music industry. So, you know, a lot of the trends are like things that have existed previously, and now it's like they're being applied to a broader scope of artists. And what you said also, you know, raises a couple of other things about stream bait too, which is that, you know, we've seen different types of stream bait play out on these services, some of which is, you know, this prioritization of music that will play well in the background and just boost engagement like overall. And then there's also been sort of like a trend towards music that's like hard, fast, the chorus hits sooner. It's like the kind of music that sort of like grabs your ears in a different way. And that's pretty interesting to think about too.
Yeah, it's about energizing also, right? But increasingly, Spotify is not only about music, as you also wrote about in your latest piece, but also about audio, meaning it wants to be a number one platform for podcasts too. Apart from potential growth in this market, of course, this is about forcing ads, advertisements onto premium subscribers, you know, who actually pay in order not to have ads. How does this work more specifically? Is this the main reason Spotify wants to go into podcasts, to force ads onto premium subscribers?
Yeah, well, so as I wrote in the article, the question about advertising, it's pretty tricky, right? Because in the piece, I interviewed someone who used to work at Spotify who spoke with me anonymously, who talked about how, you know, within the company, there seems to be some discussion that podcasting would be this way to reach more people's ears with advertisements, that they had people's ears, they weren't making money through music, and they were thinking about how else can we monetize people's ears. Well, with podcasting, you know, there's already a culture of podcast hosts reading advertisements within the podcast itself. So maybe there's this thinking that podcasting would be this way to push more advertisements on people who have premium subscriptions, which in their terms and conditions means that, you know, you won't hear the advertisements every 3 or so songs. But interestingly, this person who I interviewed who used to work there also, provided some insight on how little profit the company actually does make from digital advertising, from advertising in general. And, the direct quote from him was that per his back of the napkin math, he thinks what Spotify is not making any money off of advertising and that it just doesn't add up. So I pointed to another piece from Water and Music that was published earlier this year where another former Spotify person was talking about how, maybe this sort of overblowing of their capabilities with advertising is just another way to attract Wall Street investment. So it is kind of interesting to think about. Obviously, this is based on perspectives, but I think that is it does kind of complicate the conversation about advertising a bit. But either way, I think something that we have seen through the podcasting strategy is definitely that, it is very in line with the extent to which this has always been a model that prioritizes pop stars and celebrities. And, within podcasting, it seems like on Spotify, it's been like the celebrities that they have brought onto the platform who have gotten the best arrangements. And that has been clear through some of the union organizing that has happened at Spotify by staff who work at the podcasting companies that they have bought, as well as just by looking at, where they're putting their money.
Now, another interesting thing you pointed us towards in that piece, Liz, is the question of policy. Because if Spotify goes heavily into podcasts now, the question, of course, arises if Spotify is to become a news outlet, right? Claiming to be just a platform, of course, like other platforms do as well. How will it deal with hate speech and far-right disinformation campaigns? Can you see already where this is heading, actually, in terms of policy, in terms of legislation in the US?
It's interesting. I don't have a lot of foresight about where it's heading, but I think these are the crucial, central questions that I think we need to be asking of streaming services as they enter more into the space of being platforms for news and information and commentary. And I think that as we do that, it's important to also, keep in mind the experiences that musicians have had over the past decade to, part of wanting to write this piece was thinking about, all of the experiences that musicians have had with these platforms over the years and how there really is some sort of useful lessons to sort of draw out of that experience as a way of contextualizing the types of questions that we're asking of streaming services as they become increasingly platforms that people go to for news and podcasts.
Yeah, this will be really interesting in the very near future, right? What's happening there? Another thing you already pointed to, my last question about the wish to unionize actually of independent podcast writers and so forth. I mean, that's something musicians wanted to do for a long time, and it's very hard to do, not only in the U.S. but anywhere in the world. Actually, something that has not worked very well for musicians in the last couple of decades. And now I'm thinking of Proposition 22 in California that just hasn't passed, about gig workers not to be actually employed under the law for, like Lyft and Uber and so forth. And everybody thought, well, this is going to pass. It didn't pass. The platforms were actually strong enough to campaign against this Proposition 22, which was a very bad signal for workers' rights for all over the U.S. and maybe for the world, because it's been, there's been a lot of news coverage actually of that. So where do you think this is heading as a last outlook? What can policy do here, and what the civil society maybe even? What do have the gig workers in the podcast industry at hand to change that in the near future?
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting. So there are within within Spotify, there are three different unions, I think, with the Gimlet Union, the Ringer Union, and the Parcast Union. There might even be another one that I'm forgetting. And then, thinking about that to me in conversation with, there are so many ongoing unionizing efforts right now within independent music. I'm thinking of, there's this new musicians union called the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers, who just launched a campaign called the Justice at Spotify campaign. But outside of that, also, we're doing some interesting things earlier this year regarding calling on elected officials in the United States to ensure better protections for musicians and gig workers in general during the coronavirus crisis. And I think that, connecting the dots between what freelance working independent musicians are dealing with, like in the platform economy, with the struggles of gig workers in general, is a really important connection to make, because for many reasons, but one I think that is interesting is the fact that, musicians are sort of like the original gig workers who have always sort of like operated on these terms. And a lot of the sort of like spirit of that, I think, has been like exploited by the gig economy in general, and attempting to sort of like rebrand the type of labor relationships that people have today. And to take it even one step further, now you have companies like Spotify and other streaming services taking that sort of gig economy mindset and like trying to resell it to musicians through streaming services. It just seems crucially important that musicians are part of this conversation. And doing things like forming unions that are actively in solidarity with gig workers.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very interesting. I didn't know actually there was so much movement in the wish to unionize in those sectors of the economy. That comes as a slight surprise to me. So, again,
Yeah,
we
and
don't know
there's
that
other
much
groups
about the
too.
US. Pardon me, I didn't get that, Liz. I was interfering with you.
Oh, it's okay. No, I was going to say is, so there's like a bunch of different groups. There's the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. There's also this thing called the Music Workers Alliance. And then, there also have been a bunch of different actions organized by the different like SAG-AFTRA musicians during COVID. Like it's been really interesting seeing how many different music organizing efforts have popped up this year.
Okay. Let's end on this positive note. Thank you so much, Liz Pelly, for granting us insight into your work. It was very good talking to you, and I hope to meet
Thank
you in
you.
person one of these days back in Berlin when we can still travel. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you. And likewise, really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.